Some examples of their strange teachings are that the faithful slave protects pedophiles, or that slave will exploit you so they can live lives of luxury. Those are both bald-faced lies.
I was almost 5 years old when my uncle sexually abused me. A few years later, another uncle, an elder this time, abused me too. Growing up, I didn't believe something like that could happen inside Jehovah's organization. I believed that this was God's organization here on earth, and I believed children would be protected. And for more than 50 years, I never stopped believing that. Hi, everyone. I'm Rose. I was born as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and for most of my life, I believed I understood what happened to me. I thought my story was about two men and the terrible choices that they had made. I never imagined it might also be about the system that surrounded them, and that realization changed everything for me. It sent me on a journey through court records, government investigations, organizational publications, and the stories of survivors from around the world. I wasn't looking for reasons to leave my religion. I wasn't trying to attack the people inside of it. I was trying to answer one question. How could something like this happen inside the religion that I trusted? And that's what this video is about. Not telling you what to believe, but simply following the evidence wherever it leads. After sharing my story, I realized something. If you're going to understand what happened to me, you first have to understand what I believed. I was born as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. I wasn't simply raised in a religion. I was raised believing that this was God's organization here on earth. And that wasn't just something I heard from the platform. It was the world I grew up in. Some of my earliest memories are getting dressed for meetings, sitting beside my parents in the Kingdom Hall, going out in field service, and spending weekends at assemblies. This wasn't just part of my childhood. It was my childhood. My father was an elder, and as a little girl, that meant something to me. People respected him, and they came to him when they needed help. I believed the elders were the loving shepherds. I believed they protected the congregation. And because of that, I never questioned whether children were safe. It never even occurred to me that I should. Now, I don't think those beliefs are unusual. I think they're exactly what many of us believed. We trusted the adults around us. We trusted the brothers who had been given responsibility. We believed that if something serious ever happened, the people Jehovah had appointed would do what was right. At 5 years old, I didn't know anything about organizational policies. I didn't know anything about judicial committees. I didn't know how allegations were even handled. I only knew one thing. Adults were supposed to protect children. That was the world I believed in. It would take decades before I realized that the questions I needed to ask weren't only about one man. They were about the system that surrounded him. When you're a child, you don't always understand what's happening around you. You only know how it makes you feel. I knew something had happened that shouldn't. I knew I felt confused. I knew I felt afraid. And like so many children, I didn't have the words to explain it. For a long time, I tried to put those memories behind me, and life moved forward. I continued growing up as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. I continued believing the organization I loved reflected God's standards. I didn't spend my life looking for reasons to question it. In fact, I spent most of my life defending it. But some questions never completely disappear, do they? Every so often, they find their way back. Why did this happen? Could it have been prevented? Did anyone know? Was my experience truly isolated? Or had other kids lived through something very similar? For years, I didn't know where to find those answers. Eventually, I decided to start looking. I thought I was researching one event from my own life. I had no idea I was about to uncover a much larger story. As a child, I didn't fully understand what had happened. I only knew that something inside me had changed. Children don't always have the words to explain experiences that don't make any sense to them. They simply learn to live with them, and that's what I did. Life continued. I went to meetings. I went out in field service. I grew up believing I was part of God's organization. On the outside, everything looked normal. But inside, I carried questions that I couldn't answer. Why did it happen? Could it have been prevented? Did anyone know? For years, I believed what happened to me was simply the action of one individual. I never blamed the organization. I believed something like this could happen anywhere. But I also believed Jehovah's Witnesses were different. I believed that if something serious happened, the people entrusted with caring for the congregation would do what was right. Those beliefs stayed with me for decades, and so did the questions. Some questions don't disappear. They wait quietly, sometimes for years, sometimes for most of a lifetime, until you're finally ready to ask them. Eventually, my question changed. It was no longer only, why did this happen to me? It became, what happened after it happened? How was it handled? What was I never taught? Was my experience truly an isolated tragedy or part of something much larger? I didn't know it then, but those questions were about to take me somewhere I never expected. For most of my life, I wasn't searching for reasons to question my faith. I pioneered. I got married. I raised my family. And I continued serving as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. In fact, I often defended the organization because I believed what had happened to me could have happened anywhere. I thought the only person that I really needed to understand was the man who abused me. But once I began asking what happened after the abuse, the story became much larger. What guidance had the elders received? What policies were in place? Had those policies changed over time? And had other survivors been left with the same questions? So I started searching. At first, I wasn't trying to make a video. I wasn't trying to expose anyone. I simply wanted to understand. Now, I expected to find a few difficult stories. Instead, I found court records, government investigations, organizational publications, internal correspondence discussed in legal proceedings, testimony from former elders, and survivors from different countries describing experiences that echoed many of the same questions I had carried for years. The more I researched, the more I realized this wasn't only about my childhood anymore. It was about understanding a system I had trusted my entire life. But before I could understand how allegations were handled, I first had to understand how decisions were made. Who provided the direction? What procedures were elders expected to follow? And what happened when protecting the organization and protecting a child didn't lead to the same response? And that's where my search truly began. I wish I could tell you that what happened to me was unique, that somehow my family failed, or my congregation failed, or a few individuals made terrible decisions. For years, that's what I believed. I never imagined that one day I would ask a different question. What if this wasn't just my story? What if it was happening to other children in other congregations and in other countries? And if it was happening, why? That question became impossible to ignore. It would take me years, but eventually I started looking for answers. I didn't begin researching because I wanted to leave my religion, and I wasn't looking for reasons to criticize Jehovah's Witnesses. I was looking for an answer. I needed to understand what had happened to me. Was my experience a terrible exception, or was it part of something much larger? So I started reading. I read court records. I read government investigations, newspaper articles, survivor accounts, internal documents that had become public through lawsuits. I expected to find a few heartbreaking cases, maybe some elders who had handled things badly, maybe a congregation that failed to follow direction. Instead, I kept seeing the same story, different names, different congregations, and different countries. But so many of the details were painfully familiar, and it felt surreal, realizing that other survivors had experienced things so much like I had. And it was hard to wrap my head around. For so many years, I thought that this was my story. Suddenly, I realized that it wasn't. Children who tried to tell someone, families left devastated, allegations handled within the congregation, victims carrying shame that never belonged to them. And the more I researched, the more one thing became clear. This wasn't simply a collection of isolated tragedies. There was a pattern, and once I saw that pattern, I couldn't unsee it. I no longer needed to ask whether child sexual abuse had occurred within Jehovah's Witnesses. The difficult question had become, why had this pattern continued for so long? To answer that, I had to begin examining the policies, the procedures, and the culture surrounding the way these cases were handled. It took me a long time to understand something. What happened to me wasn't only about one man. It wasn't only about my uncle. It wasn't even only about my congregation. The more I researched, the more I began asking a different question. How could the same kinds of stories keep appearing in different congregations, in different states, in different countries, over so many years? The answer couldn't simply be that there were individual people making individual mistakes. There had to be something larger, a system. As one of Jehovah's Witnesses, I had been taught that elders were appointed by Holy Spirit, and they were loving shepherds. They were there to protect the congregation. Because I believed this was God's organization, I assumed protecting children would always come first. If abuse happened, surely the organization would want to know. Every effort would be made to protect the child. Anyone who posed a danger would be kept away from others. That belief was so deeply rooted in me, I had never thought to question it. But as I continued researching, I began finding accounts from former elders, court records, official testimony, and organizational policies. Again and again, elders described being instructed to contact the branch office for direction before taking further action. From there, they were guided through the organization's procedures. I learned about the application of the two-witness rule to accusations of serious wrongdoing. I learned about confidentiality, internal investigations, judicial committees, congregation records that most members never knew existed. These weren't simply decisions made by one elder or one body of elders in one congregation. They reflected procedures used throughout the organization. And that was the realization I struggled to accept. For most of my life, I had believed that protecting God's organization and protecting children would always be the same thing. And for the first time, I had to consider the possibility that they weren't. That protecting the reputation of the organization and protecting children could sometimes become competing priorities. That realization changed the question for me. I was no longer asking why individual people had failed. I began asking whether the system itself made those failures more likely. Not because every elder was uncaring, not because every congregation handled things the same way, and not because every outcome was identical. But when similar stories continue to surface across different places over many years, the system itself has to be examined, not to sensationalize what happened, and not to attack every person inside the organization, but to ask honest questions. When a system is designed to protect the organization, what happens when that goal comes into conflict with protecting a child? That was the question I couldn't stop asking, and it led me to evidence that reached far beyond my own story. By this point, I had read policies, I had read court records, I had listened to survivors from around the world, and one thing kept coming back to me. This couldn't be explained by just a few bad elders. There were too many congregations, too many families, too many decades, and too many survivors telling remarkably similar stories. I wasn't asking why one elder failed. I was asking why the organization kept producing the same outcome. To answer that, I had to stop looking at individual cases. I had to look at the culture itself. One thing surprised me more than anything else. The people I grew up with weren't monsters. They were sincere. They loved God. Many of them genuinely believed they were protecting the organization. So, how could so many well-intentioned people repeatedly fail to protect children? The answer wasn't simply a policy. It was the culture surrounding those policies. From the time we were children, we were taught to trust Jehovah's organization, to trust the elders Jehovah had appointed, and to avoid bringing reproach on Jehovah's name, to wait on Jehovah, to believe that doing things Jehovah's way was always better than doing things the world's way. And those ideas became part of who you are. When someone makes an accusation against a respected elder, your first instinct isn't suspicion, it's disbelief. When someone suggests calling the police, your first thought isn't always, protect the child. Sometimes it's, what will this do to Jehovah's name? And that's a difficult thing to admit. But after 50 years inside the organization, I understand why people think that way, because I thought that way too. But then I began asking another question. What kind of crime almost never has a second witness? Child sexual abuse. It's one of the most secretive crimes imaginable. Predators don't abuse children in front of other people. They deliberately isolate them, which made me realize something. Policies designed for resolving disputes between adults don't necessarily protect children. And if those policies are never questioned, they can unintentionally protect the very people they were never meant to protect. That realization changed everything for me, because this was no longer just about my story. It wasn't even about Jehovah's Witnesses. It was about what can happen whenever loyalty to an institution becomes more important than protecting the most vulnerable. And that's a lesson every organization should be willing to examine. Understanding the system took me years. For a long time, I kept asking the wrong question. I asked why no one protected me, why the adults around me didn't stop what was happening, why the people I trusted seemed unable to see what I needed. Eventually, I started asking a different question. What was it about the system that made good people respond the way they did? And that's the question that changed everything. Growing up, I didn't think child sexual abuse could happen within Jehovah's organization. If someone had asked me back then, I would have said it happened somewhere else. Not here. That belief shaped the way I saw the world. It also made it much harder to recognize that the very thing I thought couldn't happen was happening to me. The hardest thing I had to accept was that I didn't believe most elders were trying to protect abusers. I believe many sincerely thought they were doing what Jehovah wanted them to do. They trusted the procedures. They trusted the organization. They trusted the arrangement. And because they trusted the system, they didn't always question whether the system itself could fail. Over time, I realized the system wasn't just a collection of policies. It shaped the way people thought. We were taught that the organization was directed by Jehovah. We were taught that the elders represented Jehovah's arrangement. We were taught that loyalty meant trusting that arrangement, even when we didn't fully understand it. When you've believed those things your entire life, questioning the system can begin to feel like questioning God. And when asking difficult questions feels wrong, recognizing serious problems becomes much harder. For years, I wondered why no one protected me. I thought maybe I wasn't just worth protecting. Maybe it was my fault. But research changed that. I began realizing the people around me weren't simply making individual decisions. They had been taught how to think. They trusted the process, even when the process failed. Understanding that didn't erase what happened. It didn't lessen the responsibility of those who made decisions. Children still deserved protection. Families deserved honesty. And victims deserved to be believed. Understanding the system isn't about excusing harm. It's about understanding how similar failures could happen again and again in different congregations, in different countries, over decades. The tragedy wasn't simply that individuals failed. It was that a system many sincere people trusted could fail the very children it was supposed to protect. Understanding the system answered questions I had carried for years, but it also forced me to face a painful reality. The hardest part wasn't realizing the system could fail. It was realizing I had spent my entire life believing that it couldn't, and that realization hasn't erased the pain, but it finally helped me understand it. And that's why I'm sharing this story. Not to tell anyone what they should believe, but because understanding how a system works is the first step toward making sure children are protected. Because every child deserves to be heard. Every child deserves to be believed. And every child deserves to be safe. After everything I had learned, I found myself asking one final question. Have the changes gone far enough? To be fair, some things have changed since I was a little girl. There is greater public awareness. There is more training. There are policies today that did not exist decades ago. And I'm genuinely glad for every change that makes children safer. Every positive step matters. But policy is only one part of the picture. The question I kept coming back to wasn't simply whether the written instructions had changed. It was whether the culture had changed. Do children today feel safe reporting abuse? Do Parents know exactly what to do if their child comes forward. Can elders openly acknowledge mistakes without fearing they're bringing reproach on Jehovah's name? Are difficult questions welcomed, or are they still seen as a lack of trust? Those aren't easy questions, but they're important ones, because protecting children isn't measured by what a policy says on paper. It's measured by what happens when a frightened child asks for help. But after everything I had experienced, everything I had researched, I couldn't stop asking one question. Have the changes gone far enough to protect the next child who comes forward? And that question is one I still carry with me. Not because I'm looking for perfection, but because every child deserves protection. I've read statements from the organization saying they abhor child abuse. I believe every organization should. I also know there are Jehovah's Witnesses who genuinely love children and sincerely want to do what's right. This isn't about questioning the sincerity of every individual. It's about asking whether the system consistently protects the children who depend on it. I don't measure success by whether an organization says it protects children. I measure it by whether children are actually protected. Policies can change. Training can change. Procedures can change. Real change happens when a child never has to wonder, will anyone believe me? My hope is that one day, no child inside any religion, any organization, any school, or any family will ever be afraid to tell the truth. And if they do, the first response they receive won't be doubt. It will be protection, because every child deserves to be heard, believed, and feel safe. When I first began this journey, I thought I was searching for answers about my own childhood. I wanted to understand what had happened to me. I wanted to know how something like this could happen inside the religion that I trusted. At first, I believed I was researching one painful chapter of my own life. I never imagined I would end up examining an entire system. For a long time, I thought this story was only about me. I don't believe that anymore. Along the way, I learned that sincere people can become part of systems that produce harmful outcomes. I learned that good intentions by themselves aren't always enough to protect children. I learned that policies matter. Culture matters. Accountability matters. But perhaps the most important thing that I learned is that asking honest questions isn't a lack of faith. It's how we discover the truth. This video was never about attacking every witness. Many of the people I love still believe, and I understand why. Because I believed it too, for more than 50 years. This has never been about questioning the sincerity of every individual. It's about asking whether any organization should be beyond honest examination, especially when children's safety is involved. If this journey has taught me anything, it's that protecting an institution and protecting children should never become competing priorities. Every child deserves to be heard. Every allegation deserves to be taken seriously. And every child deserves to be safe. My hope isn't that people walk away from this video angry. My hope is that they walk away asking better questions. Because every organization, every religion, every school, and every family should be willing to examine itself honestly when the safety of children is at stake. If asking difficult questions helps protect even one child, then those questions are worth asking. If you'd like to understand more about the research that led me to these conclusions, I invite you to watch my companion documentary, I Didn't Understand It Then, How Abuse Was Really Handled. In it, I explore the history, the publications, and the evidence that shaped my understanding. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you found this video valuable, please like and subscribe, algorithms and all. It really does help this video reach more people, and perhaps help protect the next child. As always, take care of yourselves and keep searching.